Growing up, I watched The Hunchback of Notre Dame all the time. Esmeralda was my favorite character. Mostly because she had an adorable goat as a sidekick, but also because she stood up for what she believed in and didn't take no for an answer. Same as Phoebus, although he didn't have an adorable goat as a sidekick, so not my favorite. A few months ago, I found a copy of Victor Hugo's A Hunchback of Notre Dame, which we can all probably guess is what the Disney movie is loosely based on. Emphasis on loosely. I slowly worked my way through this chunky book, and while I fully expected the book storyline to be darker and a lot different from the Disney movie, I didn't anticipate how different and how much darker it was really going to be. I found the differences and the similarities super interesting, and I can honestly say that The Hunchback of Notre Dame is among my top 5 favorite books now after reading it. So I wanted to go through, sit down, and tell you the storyline of the book's telling so that you can also see the similarities and differences in the book and Disney's retelling. So starting out, I wanted to just go over a very quick storyline of Disney's version of Hunchback of Notre Dame. The movie opens with a story of how Frollo came to take care of Quasimodo. While rounding up gypsies, he steals a baby from a mother, and upon seeing how hideous it is, attempts to throw it into a well. The priest of Notre Dame stops him, and Frollo then becomes responsible for raising the child. Our main story begins about 20 years later, during the Festival of Fools. Quasimodo, the hunchback, sneaks out of the cathedral for the first time to attend this festival and see what being among people is like. After winning a competition for ugliest face, Quasimodo is crowned the King of Fools. The crowd, knowing he is the bell ringer of Notre Dame, quickly turns their celebration into mocking and ties down Quasimodo, hurling objects and insults at him. In his fear, Quasimodo cries out for help to his master, Claude Frollo, who's watching the events unfold. In a rage about Quasimodo leaving the bell tower without his consent, Frollo does nothing to help. Esmeralda, a beautiful gypsy girl, intervenes and scolds the crowd and Frollo for their behavior. Frollo, who hates gypsies, especially Esmeralda, because her beauty is an overwhelming temptation to him, orders his captain of the guard, Phoebus, to arrest her. Phoebus, who has already started growing a soft spot for Esmeralda, furtively helps her escape into Notre Dame, where she claims sanctuary. Frollo tells her if she ever leaves the cathedral, she will be killed. She becomes friends with Quasimodo, and he helps her escape without the guards seeing her. Quasimodo then forces Phoebus to leave the cathedral, but realizes he only meant to apologize to Esmeralda for trapping her. Frollo has an internal struggle with lusting after Esmeralda and wanting all the gypsies dead. When he learns she escaped, he goes on a rampage through Paris to find her. Phoebus defies Frollo by refusing to set a house on fire with a family in it, and is shot with an arrow when he tries to run. Frollo thinks him dead, but Esmeralda saves him and takes him to Quasimodo to protect him. Frollo visits Quasimodo and reveals that he knows about Quasimodo's feelings for the gypsy, and he says he's going to attack the gypsy's hideout the following morning. Quasimodo and Phoebus work together to find the gypsies to warn Esmeralda, but in doing so, they lead Frollo right to them, and everyone is captured. The next morning, Esmeralda is tied to a stake in the middle of the town square, and Frollo gives her an ultimatum: be with him or die. She spits in his face, making her choice obvious, and he lights the brush under her on fire. The other gypsies and Phoebus watch from their cages while Quasimodo, who's chained up at the top of Notre Dame, breaks his chains and rescues Esmeralda at the last moment, reclaiming sanctuary. Phoebus and the gypsies escape and begin fighting the guards, who are helping Frollo break into the church. Quasimodo also helps by throwing beams, rocks, and molten metal from the top of the cathedral. Frollo gets into the church and tries to kill Quasimodo, but in his attempt, falls off the side of the building to his death. Phoebus, Esmeralda, and Quasimodo emerge from the church as heroes, and everyone lives happily ever after. Except Frollo, because he's dead. So that's Disney's storyline in a nutshell. Now let's take a much slower approach through Victor Hugo's telling of The Hunchback of Notre Dame as it relates to the Disney movie. And I say as it relates to the Disney movie because there is a host of characters and details that Disney fully omitted from their retelling, and for the sake of time, and also in an attempt to not confuse you any more than necessary, I will also be omitting those characters and details from this story. I want you to pause this video and in the comments, write down what some of the things are that you think Disney changed. So according to the Disney movie, write down what you think some details that Disney had in the storyline are different, what might have been the same, what you think is completely fabricated by Disney, and also throw in some details that you think might be in the book that Disney left out altogether. I'll wait while you type. Okay, now back onto the story. Our book opens with the Feast of Fools. There is a competition to see who can make the ugliest face, and that person is crowned the Pope of Fools. The game begins, and soon we are introduced to Quasimodo, who wins by a landslide. The crowd recognizes him as the bell ringer from Notre Dame, and it's soon discovered that he's deaf and prefers not to speak. Then the crowd deems him an even more appropriate pope. Quasimodo allows them to array him with a crown and robes and be placed on a platform and lifted into the air by 12 men. And I say allows to because unlike the movie, Quasimodo has had past experiences with people and knows how cruel they can be. So while he's not scared of them at all, he does tend to have a pretty short temper if they do something he doesn't like. So the men lift him into the air, and they then proceed to parade him through the streets and public squares. Later that evening, we are introduced to Esmeralda. She is seen dancing by firelight in the middle of a large crowd in the same square that Quasimodo was crowned earlier that day. One onlooker, who we later learn is Claude Frollo, is more absorbed in her movements than anyone else in the crowd. Esmeralda begins doing tricks with her goat, Jolly, but shudders with fear at the sight and voice of Frollo, who, at seeing the tricks, exclaims, "There is sorcery in this." Shortly after this, the procession that was leading Quasimodo through the city re-enters the square, much larger than when it started. When Frollo sees Quasimodo being carried about, he rushes forward and snatches the staff out of Quasimodo's hands. Quasimodo's first instinct is to attack who did this, but upon seeing who took the staff, he falls on his knees in submission. After Frollo angrily shakes Quasimodo's shoulders, the two of them vanish down a dark, narrow street. The book follows another character who that evening is following Esmeralda through the endless maze of side streets in Paris. He witnesses her being grabbed by two figures, one of them being Quasimodo. The man shouts for the men of the guard to come help Esmeralda, but upon being noticed is flung backwards by a single backstroke from Quasimodo. Quasimodo then lifts Esmeralda over his shoulder and begins to leave when the guards show up to help. The captain of the guard, who we later learn is Phoebus, tears Esmeralda away from Quasimodo, and when Quasimodo tries to take her back, he is surrounded by archers, seized, and garroted. Esmeralda, who is immediately won over by the captain, asks for his name and then slips off the horse and vanishes. The next section of the book takes a second to describe Quasimodo's origins and a little backstory of Claude Frollo. Quasi was discovered in a bedstead near the entrance of Notre Dame, where children would be placed whose mothers couldn't care for them in hopes that someone would take the child and raise them as their own. Quasimodo was about 4 years old when he was discovered there, and a very large crowd of older women looked on at him with fear and disgust. While they were talking of killing the demon, as they called Quasimodo, a young priest, our very own Frollo, comes up and claims Quasi for adoption. Frollo was an incredibly learned individual. He studied theology, decretals, medicine, language, all by the age of 18. And by 20, he was the youngest priest in Notre Dame, and this was when he rescued Quasimodo. As Quasi grew up, Frollo taught him to speak, read, and write, but when the bells of the church made him deaf, he chose to remain silent. Quasimodo was blindly loyal to Claude Frollo. Even when Frollo was extremely harsh and severe to him, the book describes it that in Quasimodo, the archdeacon had the most submissive of slaves, the most docile of servants, the most watchful of guardians. And one sign from Claude and the idea that it would please him would have been enough for Quasimodo to hurl himself from the top of the cathedral towers. Getting back to our hunchback and the predicament that we left him in with the guards. The day after he was captured by the guards, he stands trial and is given a much harsher sentence than deserved. He's bound to a wheel in the square that, when it's turned, gives view of his face to everyone who is there watching. It's the same spot where the day before, everyone treated him as royalty. Quasimodo allows himself to be tied and bound, unaware of why they're doing it. It isn't until the wheel starts turning and a whip starts making contact with his back that Quasimodo realizes what's happening and begins to struggle against the bonds. When it's clear that he cannot escape, he gives up and hangs his head as though dead. When the flogging ends, he remains bound where he is for another hour, while the crowd hurls insults and stones at him. At one point, Quasimodo looks up and sees Frollo riding past, and his face becomes radiant as if seeing his savior. But as soon as Frollo sees Quasimodo, he turns and rides away quickly so as not to be seen. Finally, when Quasimodo has been nearly stoned to death, he cries out in a hoarse voice that sounds more like a bark. Water. The crowd mocks him as he cries for water a second and third time. Then he watches the crowd part as Esmeralda walks toward him. Quasimodo thinks she's coming to seek revenge for him trying to carry her off the night before. Instead, she silently climbs to where he is and lifts a gourd full of water to his lips. After taking a very long drink, Quasimodo goes to kiss her hands in thanks, but Esmeralda pulls her hand back as if she's afraid he's trying to bite her. Esmeralda leaves, and Quasimodo is released to return to Notre Dame. So several weeks pass, and now we come to when Esmeralda and Phoebus meet for the second time. Phoebus is in a house that sits on the edge of the square in front of Notre Dame. This house belongs to the mother of Phoebus's fiancé. Phoebus is feigning interest in what his fiancée and her friends are working on because his mind is elsewhere. The book describes his interests as coarse witticisms, military gallantries, easygoing beauties, and easy conquests. His fiancée sees a gypsy dancing in the square and asks if it's the same girl he saved. Phoebus says it is because he recognizes the goat. They call Esmeralda over and it is clear that she remembers Phoebus very clearly. While Phoebus is being charmed by Esmeralda, one of the girls lures Jolly away and opens a bag around his neck, pouring out tiles with letters written on them. The goat begins performing a trick Esmeralda had taught him and arranges the letters to spell Phoebus. When everyone sees this, Esmeralda turns red with embarrassment and scoops up the letters and vanishes out the door with Jolly. Now, backing up slightly, before Esmeralda had gone into the house with Phoebus, Frollo had been watching her dance from a tower in the cathedral. He becomes very jealous when he sees another man with her in the square, and while Esmeralda goes into the house with Phoebus, Frollo goes down and questions this strange man about the gypsy. He learns this man is among the gypsies, and he told Frollo of the trick with the tiles that the goat could do. Frollo, having never met Phoebus, is unfamiliar with the name, but becomes obsessed with finding out what it means. Several more weeks pass, and one day Frollo overhears a conversation between two young men and catches one of their names, Phoebus. He stealthily follows the men and learns that Phoebus is meeting Esmeralda at an inn that night. Frollo follows the men and waits while they spend all their money in a bar. Shortly thereafter, Phoebus discovers that he's being followed by a cloaked figure, and when he turns to fight the figure, Frollo, who's still concealing his identity, offers Phoebus money for the room on the condition that he be hidden somewhere he can see into the room so Phoebus can prove he really is meeting who he says he is. Phoebus agrees and hides Frollo in a closet in the room that has a considerable crack in the door. Phoebus leaves and returns after a few minutes with Esmeralda. Frollo watches as Phoebus tries to seduce the gypsy. The two speak of loving each other, the book making it clear that Esmeralda's love for the captain is passionate and almost all-consuming, while Phoebus's love is the same love he's shared for many other women on many other nights. Frollo, full of lust and rage, watches on, and when it's clear that Phoebus is about to have his way with the girl and his back is turned to the door, Frollo breaks out of his hiding spot and stabs him. Esmeralda, in her fright, faints, and Frollo escapes out the window that overlooks the river. When Esmeralda wakes up, officers are in the room carrying off Phoebus and saying that she is a sorceress who stabbed him. Esmeralda stands trial and pleads innocent until they begin to torture her. Then she changes her plea to guilty and is entirely broken of spirit. And right there is where I am going to leave off this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed the first half of the retelling of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and make sure to stay tuned for next week's video, which will be the second half of the story. Let me know what you think of the story so far in the comments, and if you have gotten any of your predictions that you left right, or if you were completely off. Also, if you've read the book, let me know how I'm doing as far as describing it in a very abridged version. Have a great day, and like I said, stay tuned for next week's video, which will be the second part. Bye!